Welcome to the Empathy Stories channel, where we bring you touching and unexpected tales of kindness in the most unlikely places. In tonight's story, a successful millionaire's life is forever changed after encountering a young girl and her baby on a cold, rainy night in London. This is a story of compassion, connection, and a moment that alters the course of their lives. The rain was relentless that night, hammering against the windshield of my classic Mercedes-Benz. The rhythmic sound of droplets clattering against the glass, blending with the swirling thoughts in my mind. London, usually vibrant and alive, now lay deserted beneath the storm. The streets nearly empty, save for the occasional car or pedestrian hurrying to get out of the downpour. The historic buildings with their stone facades and ivy-covered walls seemed to dissolve into the shadowed gloom, transforming the city into something otherworldly, silent, ghostly, and almost unreal. I'm not one to entertain self-pity, but that night, it felt impossible to ignore the emptiness inside me. At 47, I had everything that one could possibly desire. Wealth, status, a sprawling townhouse in the heart of the city. On paper, I was successful. Yet, when I lay in my bed at night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something essential was missing. All the luxury in the world couldn't fill the void that had settled deep within me. That evening, I had just finished another exhausting round of meetings, the kind that left you mentally drained, yet somehow didn't bring the satisfaction they were supposed to. I'd had enough. Instead of heading home along my usual route, I decided to take a detour, a minor diversion. I told myself, just a change of scenery to clear my head. As I turned the steering wheel, veering off the main road, I entered a part of the city I rarely visited. The further I drove, the quieter the streets became. The tall, elegant buildings were replaced with smaller, older structures, once grand, now weathered by time. As I made my way down the dimly lit street, I couldn't help but notice something unusual. A flash of movement caught my eye. I slowed the car, instinctively pressing the brake harder as I turned toward the alleyway from which the figure had emerged. It was a girl, no older than 8 or 9. She was huddled against the stone wall, drenched to the bone, her small body shaking with the cold. In her arms, she cradled a bundle. At first, I couldn't quite make out what it was, but as I pulled closer, I realized it was a baby. For a moment, I hesitated. Every part of me screamed to turn away, to pretend I hadn't seen anything. People like me don't get involved in the problems of strangers, let alone stray children on a miserable night. But something, a faint tug deep inside, urged me to stop. I pulled into the alleyway, the tires of my car splashing through the growing puddles as I stopped just a few feet away from her. The girl looked up at the headlights, her wide eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and something else, perhaps hope. I got out of the car, my coat instantly soaked by the downpour, and walked toward her slowly, trying not to frighten her further. I wasn't used to this, used to handling business, numbers, and problems that could be solved with logic and cold decisions, but this situation was different. I didn't know how to act, what to say, so I spoke gently, unsure if she would even respond. "Hey," I called softly, trying to make my voice sound reassuring despite the chill creeping into my bones. "Are you all right? Where are your parents?" She didn't answer at first. Instead, she just stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. I could see the cold had already taken its toll. Her lips were blue, her skin pale. The baby in her arms was no better, its tiny face scrunched up in discomfort, its small body shaking uncontrollably. I repeated my question, stepping closer. "Where are your parents? Is there anyone with you?" She glanced down at the baby in her arms, then back up at me, her eyes filled with uncertainty. There was a long pause, one that seemed to stretch forever. Then, as though she made up her mind, she slowly nodded and extended her hand toward me. It wasn't a gesture of trust, but of necessity. She was too tired, too cold to remain in the alley any longer. Without thinking too much, I reached down and gently took her hand in mine. The moment I touched her, something inside me shifted. A deep, primal instinct to protect, She didn't speak, but the small, cold fingers that curled around mine were enough to tell me that I was doing the right thing. I picked up the baby, cradling him carefully in my arms as I led the girl to the car. She didn't resist, and as I opened the door, she climbed in quietly, her eyes still wary. But there was something else there now, a small spark of trust. However fragile, the drive back to my house was silent, save for the soft hum of the car and the occasional rustle from the back seat. I glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the girl and the baby in the reflection. She sat with her knees drawn up to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around her baby brother, holding him close as if the act of doing so was the only thing that kept them both anchored in the world. When we arrived at my townhouse, the usual feeling of comfort the place provided me with seemed hollow, almost out of place. I had grown accustomed to the quiet elegance of my home, the polished furniture, the expensive decor that seemed to represent every bit of the life I had worked so hard to build. But that night, my house felt different. It felt cold, empty. I helped the girl and the baby out of the car and led them into the warmth of the foyer. "You're safe here," I said softly, as though speaking the words could somehow make them true. I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew I couldn't just turn them away. I couldn't leave them out in the cold. My housekeeper, Mrs. Hawthorne, looked up in surprise when we entered. She had always been the one who kept my life running smoothly, no questions asked, no interruptions. But this was different. "Mr. Livingston," she said, her voice faltering for just a moment as she took in the sight of the two children. "Who are these?" "I found them outside," I said, my voice steady, though I felt my heart pounding in my chest. "They were alone, in the rain. Can you prepare something warm for them?" Mrs. Hawthorne nodded without another word, her motherly instincts kicking in. She took the children to the sitting room, a place where they could rest. As I stood frozen, unsure of what to do next, the night felt longer than it should have, and the weight of my own questions lingered in the back of my mind. Who were these children? How had they ended up on the street, alone and abandoned? And why had I, of all people, felt the need to help them? As the hours passed, I sat by the fire, watching them as they slowly warmed up. The girl, whose name I learned was Emma, cradled her baby brother, Logan, in her arms, as though he were the last piece of her world that hadn't fallen apart. And as I watched her, I felt an inexplicable connection, a link that tied me to them, though I couldn't explain why. There was no turning back now. The next morning, the rain had cleared, leaving behind a damp, misty chill in the air. Mr. Livingston stood by the window of his study, gazing out at the sprawling view of the London skyline. The glass was still streaked with droplets, but the city was slowly waking up. In the distance, he could hear the faint hum of traffic and the distant chatter of people starting their day. Yet in his home, everything felt strangely still. Laura and Logan had settled into the guest room, the sound of their quiet breathing barely audible through the thick walls of his house. Mr. Livingston's thoughts were a tangled mess, pulling him in all directions. How had things come to this? One moment, he was a solitary man, accustomed to the comforts of wealth and the isolation it often brought. The next, he was suddenly responsible for two children he barely knew, children who had endured hardship beyond anything he could imagine. He couldn't shake the image of Laura's tired eyes, the way she held Logan protectively, as if she had known nothing but fear her entire life. A part of him wanted to help, to fix everything, but another part was unsure. Was he doing the right thing? What had he truly gotten himself into? As he pondered, a soft knock interrupted his thoughts. It was Mrs. Barnes, his longtime housekeeper. She had been with him for years, a loyal presence in his otherwise solitary life. She entered the study with a tray of tea, setting it down on the table before him. "Good morning, Mr. Livingston," she said, her tone warm yet tinged with concern. "How are they?" "They're fine," he replied, running a hand through his hair. He couldn't quite bring himself to say more. "They'll need more than just food and shelter, won't they?" Mrs. Barnes gave him a knowing look, then sat across from him, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "Children like them, they need time, sir, but they also need stability, safety." That's something they haven't had for a long time. Mr. Livingston nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. He hadn't asked for this responsibility, but now that it was here, he knew he couldn't simply turn his back on it. I don't know what to do for them. Mrs. Barnes, I've never been a father, never had to care for anyone but myself. She smiled softly, a quiet understanding in her eyes. You don't have to know everything right now, but you have a good heart, Mr. Livingston. That's a good start. The next few days passed in a blur. Harold, Mr. Livingston, found himself waking earlier than usual, preparing breakfast, making sure Laura and Logan were comfortable. It wasn't easy. Laura, though polite, was withdrawn, speaking in short sentences and never looking him directly in the eye. Logan, on the other hand, was a quiet child, barely a year old, but already showing signs of distress. He cried often, clutching at Laura whenever she moved away from him. Their presence in the house was like a crack in the carefully constructed walls of Mr. Livingston's life. His mornings, once spent in solitary reflection, now had the soft clatter of dishes and the distant sound of children's voices. He found himself checking in on them more than he cared to admit, drawn to the quiet strength of the little girl and the vulnerability of her baby brother. It was a Thursday afternoon when the next shift came. Harold had decided to take Laura and Logan out for a walk. The air was crisp, the sky still overcast, but without rain, offering the perfect opportunity for them to get some fresh air. Laura had been hesitant at first, but after a few gentle words, she agreed. They walked through the streets of London, passing by the grand buildings and shops. The city, as usual, was bustling with life, people going about their business, tourists snapping photos of landmarks, the noise of traffic filling the air. But within the little bubble of Harold's world, everything felt quiet. Laura walked just a step behind him, her eyes scanning their surroundings. Logan, tucked snugly in his stroller, slept soundly, his small fingers curled around the edge of his blanket. They stopped at a cafe, one of Harold's favorites, an old establishment with rich, wooden beams and shelves filled with books and antique knickknacks. He ordered tea and sandwiches for them both. As they sat down at a corner table, Harold tried again to open a conversation with Laura, who was still hesitant, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her sleeve. You know, Laura, Harold began, his voice calm and steady. I used to come here when I needed to think. It's a peaceful place. I thought maybe you'd like it. Laura glanced up at him, her expression guarded. It's nice, she said quietly, but the words felt distant, like she was saying what she thought he wanted to hear, not what she truly felt. Harold leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. I know this isn't easy, but if you ever feel like talking about anything, I'm here. She didn't answer immediately, and for a moment, Harold wondered if she'd say anything at all. But then, she looked up at him, her gaze softening for the briefest of moments. Brenda, she used to say things like that, Laura murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. But then she never meant it. It was just words. Harold's heart tightened. He didn't press her for more, not wanting to push too far. But that small sentence lingered in his mind like an echo. He had heard her mention Brenda before, the woman at the orphanage who had cast him out onto the streets. What kind of person could do that? What kind of system would allow children like Laura and Logan to be treated with such neglect? As they sat there in silence, Harold knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't sit idly by and allow them to be forgotten again. He didn't know how, or even where to start, but something inside him was waking up, a part of him that had long been dormant, buried beneath years of wealth, power, and success. For the first time in a long while, Harold Livingston felt like he had a purpose. The week after Laura and Logan arrived at his home, Harold Livingston found himself fixated on the mystery of the Greenwood Children's Home. Despite his success, wealth, and the comfortable life he'd built, he felt a growing unease about the orphanage and the way it treated its children. There was something unsettling about the way Laura and Logan spoke of it, something they couldn't yet express fully, but he could sense the fear behind their words. Laura had mentioned her mother several times, hinting at her disappearance without ever going into details. Harold didn't have answers, but he knew he couldn't ignore her. He owed it to the children, and to himself, to act. One afternoon, as they sat together in his study, Laura looked at him with hesitation, then softly asked, "Mr. Livingston, do you think we could maybe look for my mom?" Harold looked at her, his heart heavy. "Of course, Laura," he said, his voice gentle but resolute. "We'll do everything we can." The search was difficult, but Harold didn't back down. With the help of a private investigator, they tracked down an address. But when they arrived, they found only silence in an abandoned home. Laura's mother had long since disappeared, and all that remained was an old, faded picture of a woman who had once been part of Laura's life. Despite this, Harold's resolve only grew stronger. He couldn't let these children fall through the cracks again. He knew that the conditions at the orphanage had to be exposed, and that the truth about Greenwood had to come to light. Harold's determination led him to the gates of Greenwood Children's Home, the place that had cast such a shadow over Laura and Logan's lives. He had gotten access to records, and what he found confirmed his worst fears: abuse, neglect, and a system that operated in secrecy. The building itself stood cold and imposing, a place of fear for the children trapped within. His anger flared as he stared at the building. "No more," he muttered to himself. "Not on my watch." With the help of a few connections, Harold managed to expose the truth. News outlets picked up the story, and the orphanage was shut down. The staff involved were arrested, and the children were removed from harm. It wasn't a perfect resolution. Some of the damage couldn't be undone, but it was a victory, and it meant that no other child would suffer the way Laura and Logan had. Back home, life had slowly settled into a new rhythm. Laura and Logan had begun to open up, their guarded expressions replaced by trust. Harold's home, once silent and empty, now buzzed with life. The children, though scarred by their past, had found solace in the stability he offered. And Harold? He found himself feeling a joy he hadn't known in years. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Logan in his high chair, Laura beside him, Harold looked at the children with a sense of fulfillment. They had come a long way, but he knew their journey was far from over. Still, they were safe now, and that was what mattered most. "I'm proud of you, both of you," Harold said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Laura smiled, though it was still tentative, and for the first time, Harold felt like he had found something truly worthwhile. The next day, as they went out for a walk, Harold held Laura's hand, and Logan toddled beside them, laughing. The world felt different now, more meaningful. Harold had no illusions that everything was fixed, but he had learned something important. Life was not about power or money. It was about the connections we make, the people we care for, and the difference we can make in their lives. Laura looked up at him, her eyes wide with trust. "Thank you, Mr. Livingston," she said softly, "for everything." Harold smiled, his heart full. "You're welcome, Laura. You and Logan, your family now." And with that, the three of them walked into the future, knowing that, together, they had found something better than they could have ever imagined. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. The story of the young girl and her baby reminds us of the profound impact one act of kindness can have, not just on those in need, but on ourselves as well. If you were moved by this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring content.